Thanks. Thanks so much, and welcome. And we're gonna, so as you've already been told, I will tell you again, we're going to be talking about Geof's work as it is situated at the intersection of aesthetics and politics. And the way we're going to proceed is that Geof is going to introduce a piece, and then we'll use the image itself as a springboard for a wide-ranging discussion about some of the questions that Geof's art raises about the difference between political art and art about politics, the relationship between visual representation and political representation, and the visual manifestation of power. So without further ado, Geof, do you want to begin by introducing?
And thank you all for coming. Also, thank you, Julie, for doing this.
Thank you for your art.
This piece here is called Washington Colorfield School. And it is a 3-channel video installation. The installation shot you're looking at here is from the show that Matthew mentioned at PS1. What I did is in Los Angeles, working with about 15 actors, I took a congressional testimony done in 2003 and basically took it apart and broke it down into its individual components. So those actors sort of frame by frame reenacted the C-SPAN footage of the testimony that I took, except where they kind of broke it down into their component movements. So it's almost more like kabuki theater. So if someone went like that, the actor's movement is more like that, more kind of theatricalized. Also, as the performance went through, it broke down to the component elements of video, so RGB. So like the image on the left that is green, you know, it was green for maybe a minute, then the green shifted to the center image, and then moved over to the far right. Also, you know, blue RGB. It went through all of them. So that's the first one.
So, I mean, I'd be interested to hear why you chose actors to reenact the congressional testimony instead of just using news footage of the actual hearings. Mm-hmm. So why the move to reenactment?
I actually made this, or I made a really bad piece using the C-SPAN footage, kind of editing it and working back into it. And there was something about, like, you know, I was trained as like a sculptor, right? And so when you have an object, but then you make a cast of that object, like it becomes memorialized or it becomes like monumental in some way. And there's something about that, the process of removal that I was interested in. And so I just in my own studio made like these sketches with, you know, using myself, and it became like an object of contemplation rather than just like the kind of base materiality of the thing. Also, like I was interested, and I don't know if the piece does this, but one of my interests with it was kind of emptying out the meaning of the thing. Like, how can you take these, the bureaucracy is so banal, right? Like, but it is so powerful in its end result. So how do you kind of invert that, where to take these really banal activities and make them really monumental and really important was kind of, that was kind of what I was interested in.
I mean, I'm interested in the comparison you made with sculpture in terms of method, that you drew on a method that you were familiar with sculpture and then tried to somehow replicate that in the medium of video, because this piece actually reminds me of one of your sculptural installations, which is called Republic Mashup. Because what's interesting to me is that in Washington Colorfield School, you're using actors. So there's a reenactment through the medium of actors. And in this piece, as you can see there, the two sculptures on the table, those are both sculptures in which Geof began by sculpting his own face and then distorted the sculpture of his own face to resemble those of two different fringe movement leaders with whom he had spent time sort of undercover in their fringe movement encampments. So it seems like in both pieces, you're thematizing questions of imitation and representation and sympathetic identification. So I'm wondering if you see any resonances or affinities between these two pieces and the different ways that you're using representation and reenactment in the two pieces and the two mediums.
That's a good question, actually. Yeah, Yeah. Let me back up though, because you said something that I think it's like a really anal point, but an important one. Like, it's all sculpture to me.
Okay.
Like for me, like sculpture is a thinking process rather than like a specific medium. So the video, like Washington Colorfield School, it's sculpture in that it deals with like issues of space, you know, like how these objects, i.e. the figures, are moving or sitting in the space. So it's all sculpture.
Yeah.
Going back to your larger, or let me give the overview. So this is a piece called Republic Mashup, as Julie said, and it's one sculpture, not two sculptures sitting on a table. I bought a 17th century tabletop on eBay, and then I performed violence on the top. Like I turned it into like half pedestal, half tabletop. Like, so it hovers somewhere between furniture and pedestal, or furniture and sculpture. On the plinth, on the surface, there are these two figures. Like Julie said, I spent time in a far, far right kind of libertarian wingnut camp in Idaho. And then I also, in the same, like one right after the other, spent time in this far left kind of commune in New Mexico. And I was interested in, a lot of my work you'll see is really interested in binaries, like the kind of American ideal of binaries. We're a very peace-loving nation, we're a very warlike nation, we're a very permissive nation, we're also very puritanical. Like those kind of mashups I'm really interested in culturally, and how they kind of make us like the fucked up awesome country that we are. And so anyway, like I have those in me. Like, and this maybe goes to your question, like I wanted to bring out those elements of similarity and difference within those values, far right and far left, and also how all of us as a citizenry have them with one another. And I wanted to make it performative, like the blending of the two in a kind of physically manifest way was something I was really interested in. So I took a cast of myself and then worked back into it to make myself sort of blend with this kind of very, with the far left leader that you're looking in here, like very much of a cult of personality. Both these two camps were run by these very strong alpha men who sort of had these kind of very powerful personalities that could pull these people with them, as like all kind of wingnut groups probably do. So there's the far left guy, the far right. What was your question? I'm sorry, what?
To think about the resonances between the role that imitation or reenactment is playing in this piece and the way that you're using reenactment in Washington Colorfield.
Oh, right.
And maybe the political resonance of reenactment in both cases.
For me, it's role-playing rather than reenactment. And like whether that is in the individual, like through fantasy and kind of pushing myself psychologically into these other characters, or whether it's using other people to kind of play out fantasies. It's all role-playing. Where it, I think, touches politics is, more my interest in the role the individual plays in like larger political systems. So with the Washington Colorfield, I was really interested in how boring, but almost to me like in a hypnotic way, the C-SPAN footage was, and how like the effect of these really kind of boring, banal activities have, and like they spin out into larger kind of phenomenon culturally. Yeah. Like watching, I was watching some of the Senate stuff with the stimulus package, and it was like skull-crushingly boring. But it's obviously like an important thing, right? And that kind of cut, or that kind of gap, I was really interested in. And with the Washington Colorfield, it's just the individual versus the larger. Yeah. That's kind of where it's going to. Should we go back to that? Do you want to go, or this part does not work in the group talk, right? Right. So you guys saw that. This guy was great. The guy in the center was a really great actor. Okay. I've inserted a couple working drawings. I make lots of drawings. Sometimes I use like the internet. And so this is just a drawing called Black Space Conference. And this was a working drawing using the actual real C-SPAN footage that, obviously it was a working drawing for the video that you just saw.
So, I think one thing that's interesting is that, as we've just been discussing, in Washington Colorfield School itself, you opted not to use file footage, right? You opted not to use the actual news footage of the hearings, and instead hired actors to stage a reenactment or to role play. But here, you actually are using the cultural objects. So I'd be interested to hear, how do you make those decisions? And when you do choose to use cultural objects, like the photographs that you've pulled from media sources in these pictures, how and why do you alter them or customize them for your own purposes?
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to make them mine. So like with this, like I think maybe a better example is like the table in Republic Mashup. Like that is the real thing. Like that is a 17th century tabletop that I was lucky enough to find out of, in a way that I could actually gain access to. And by performing violence on it, by taking it, you kind of hybridize these things between life, like just as it exists, and also life that it can be, or like bringing out another possible history of these objects. So like here with the C-SPAN footage that you're looking at, like this is just the footage as it is, but then I work back into it, making it another possible alternative reality or another possible life that these things could have had, which again is much like art, like all art. I mean, it is art. It's a projection.
Not just like art.
It's not like art. That is what art does. It's like a projected reality that could be. I think I think it goes back to your first thing, that sometimes to be an effective piece of work, it needs to be once removed. So like I couldn't use the real footage for the Washington Colorfield School because it didn't have the kind of aspect of the contemplativeness that comes to when something is fabricated, like a painting rather than a photograph. You look at it differently. There's a hand behind it. The thing is made. So working with the political subject matter, a lot of times the downfall, which maybe we'll go to a larger conversation we'll have about political art, is that it's too close, in my opinion. Like it's right, it's not. Jesper John said art is something that you do take something from life and you do something to it, and you do something else to it, and which I think is a really smart kind of Yoda-like comment. And this stuff they're fine for working drawings, but in my opinion, it hasn't been pushed far enough to kind of hold its own.
So the defamiliarization isn't thorough enough, and it still resonates in a perhaps naive way.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way of saying it.
Great. Should we move on to Mason-Dixon lines?
This is the last big thing I made. It's called Mason-Dixon lines, and it's a sculpture. Well, it's a sculpture in two parts. And sometimes they're really close to one another. Sometimes they'll be like in different rooms. I've only shown this piece twice. So one time it was like, as you're seeing here, and one time each unit was in a different room. But it's always one piece comprised of two parts. And again, the Mason-Dixon line was this kind of artificial, formal line placed on a natural environment. I was really interested in that as sculpture, like a formal markation across a geographic area that embodied like enormous cultural value. Like that, it's like totally arty. And so kind of really in a very crude way, there's the Mason and then there's the Dixon. I was interested with the Mason, which is the one here on the right. That is a line drawing of Alan Greenspan. And it's made up of neon sheets, one being white light, white neon, and the one behind is black light. So if you're wearing a white shirt, you come close to it, it gives that glow that black light does. The Mason is a kind of very formal, abstract shape, kind of copped from a Tony Smith sculpture, kind of not, upholstered in bandana. the bandana upholstery is done from bandana, but I took apart a bunch of jeans and re-threaded in the jeans thread on the side. So it kind of has this mossy sort of hanging.
So can we talk about the Dixon for a minute?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm intrigued by the Dixon. And what I find so interesting is that you've taken this spare, abstract geometric shape. I don't know exactly what geometrical figure it is or how many sides it has. I'm sure it has a technical name. But since I don't know its name. So this is an object that has a potentially cold, abstract, rationalist resonance. And you have upholstered it in this fabric that has a very strong cultural reference, right? It resonates with us as connoting a particular sociological or demographic location. And it's also the case that you stitched it together with this jeans thread that you removed from jeans, and so there's an element of handicraft. So I really like this juxtaposition of textile and metal and craft and formalism and something very abstract and something that really resonates with and is redolent with cultural signification. So if you could, I'd really like to hear a bit more about the way you're juxtaposing these elements and the way you see the relationship between craft, and in this case especially textile craft, and abstraction in your practice.
Yeah. I mean, I think about that a lot, I think, like on an intuitive level. Like I'm really interested in finding materials that have cultural resonance in and of themselves. Like the materials kind of do a lot of the work for me as an artist. And then how is the best way to deploy those things formally? So you have this material that has like this kind of loaded kind of cultural meaning, or loaded or not, and how do you kind of extrapolate that into form is something that I think all art deals with at some level. With this one, I was interested in taking this kind of high modernist form, this form that has this perceived objectivity, and making it a really subjective form. So that's why the bandana and the sort of like my, a friend of mine from the South who I studied with, he was a really good sculptor, and he always said that it was like redneck engineering, like taking something that is like, you know, just so, and making it work for you in a really kind of beautiful way. And I was talking with him about this piece, and I was like, you know, I have these two elements, I have this Mason, this Dixon, I don't really know how to work it. And he's like, well, you should just make it just work just enough, like just barely so. And that's kind of what I attempted to do with this, which is why, like, I don't know if you guys can see it where y'all are, but like how the threads are, it's not totally sewn up, it's kind of hung shaggy, none of the threads are finished. My background, I went to a textile school in undergrad for 1.5 years, so I have, you know, I work in a lot in textiles. It's like a medium I feel really comfortable with, and that's, you know, that's how I came to this form. But the form itself and the material that it's wrapped in, ideally there should be some tension between them, you know, and like I want it to kind of want it to wrap on it, but I don't want it to seem natural to it, like it's a growth.
And is there a similar tension in the Mason?
No, there's not, and that by design. Like that one is ephemeral. Like the Mason, I always saw it as abstract liquid information. Like it's light, it can be turned on and off, it's formless. It's in this form right now because that's the form it's harnessed in. But it should not have any tension. In fact, it should be liquid. You know, light is effortless, or electricity is effortless. And the kind of real roughness of the Mason and the liquidity of this form was a really kind of purposeful thing. Like these two pieces don't look alike on purpose, but they hang out together in the same space.
Yeah. So, and I mean, now that we have this image here, in our earlier conversations, you've described your project as an attempt to show how power is communicated visually. And I'm wondering if you see this project as one of exposure, in the sense of making visible something that's invisible, showing us something that is not apparent to the naked eye, but is somehow hidden or implicit? Or is it the case that power manifests visually. We can see it every day, but we don't necessarily think about it. And your art is inviting us to stop and think in a new way about things that we already see. So I'd be interested to hear about how this piece is participating in this project of making the visual dynamics of power manifest.
I don't know if there's a singular answer for that question, but it is the project, as you say. Like, if I had to choose one, I would say the latter. I mean, I think the mechanics of power are all around us that we kind of aren't aware of them. Like, the Washington Color Field School is maybe a more kind of clear example. When I was talking about like the banal of the bureaucracy and the kind of effect it has. But for me, just for me, I think that the way power is exercised visually is all around us, and we're not really that aware of it because we've internalized the structures that they're made manifest with. So kind of mashing up two things, like the Dixon there, like by putting two things in conflict one another, it makes the kind of seams of those elements more visible. And that is why I'm interested in binaries, I think. It's subconscious. Like, I don't think most artists are aware of why they make the art that they make. And like, especially with, conceptually focused art, like I think there's this very bad, I'm gonna go way off your question right now.
That's
but,
fine.
I think there's this really bad impulse to kind of have reasons for everything.
Yeah.
But shit's fucked up, So like, you don't always know why you do things, but what the subjects you're interested in. Like with me, like I'm interested in how power is made manifest, especially in like a political context. And that to me is the project. How the art does that, I don't really even want to know how it does it, but I would say that it does it through putting unlike things together and seeing where the tensions are, or putting like, making a casting of something, like taking something and monumentalizing it or memorializing it, so you have some distance to the object that maybe you see every day.
At the risk of pressing,
does that make sense?
Yeah, no. But at the risk of pressing the how question that you don't want to answer, a different way to ask it might be: you said that this piece has been exhibited twice in two different ways.
Right.
So, what led you to make those choices about how close the two pieces should be situated to one another? And do you have a sense of how the theme of the binary juxtaposition, how does it resonate differently if the two pieces are in different rooms, or if they were moved 5 feet closer together?
Yeah, the answer for that is not going to satisfy your desire. It was completely kind of formal sculptural issues, like the spaces. I had a lot more space at the other time this was exhibited, and the configuration of the room kind of allowed more distance and more breathing room between them. I wanted to see what it would look like. The image that you're seeing here is the first time I ever shown this. And so this is the situation as it was given to me. The other time, it was the decision as a sculptor rather than any kind of larger thinking process behind it.
Should we move on to the next piece?
This piece, to be honest with you, I often don't show this piece with the other pieces that we're looking at. But it's really, I'm from California, and I'm really starting to get homesick at this point in the quarter. And so this piece I took on the beach back home. This piece is called Fucking Up with the Sun. And they are thematically protest signs for the sun after the protest is over. So they're protest signs, but they're turned upside down because the protest had ended. It is 4 digital photographs, 3 of which have kind of holding sticks, for lack of a better word, on them. What would be the word for that? Handles. It's a very romantic piece in my mind. Like, I always see it as romantic, which is kind of why I wanted to put it in today. Yeah, it's very simple. That's why they're digital prints. They're kind of blown out, like the resolution is starting to break down, so they have this kind of pixelated, I don't know if you can see, from the documentation, but they're starting to pixel out. They're just on the edge of losing their resolution.
And can we look at another piece so that we can talk about the relationship between the two of them?
Oh yeah. This is a video. You're looking at two images of the same video, just so you get some understanding of what it is. This is a piece called Untitled. In parentheses, oftentimes people read it Untitled and Will Be Again. It is a video. It projects high on the wall. It has to be about 7 feet tall, higher than any person ever would be. So you look at it you look up at it. It's about this big. It's very specific how the image is presented. It's about this big across, and over an hour loop, I believe, it fades from white to black. So as you see on the left, it's white text on black. Over a course of an hour, it very slowly, almost imperceptibly, fades from black to white. And it's endless. It is something that is in a constant process of becoming. Julie looked at this piece and said that it was a lot like this quote from Nietzsche, or you actually take the ball.
It made me think of Nietzsche's injunction to become what you are. And in Ecce Homo, which is Nietzsche's autobiography, the subtitle of that book is How One Becomes What One Is. And so people have often said there's something paradoxical about this, because how can you become what you are? So there's a paradoxical relationship between being and becoming that Nietzsche is trying to work with. And it seemed to me that there was something similar going on here in the relationship between being and becoming.
Which I would love to say that I was thinking about, and I didn't. I just thought it'd be cool if something was always becoming something else endlessly, like endless puberty. Is what I was honest. That is actually what I was thinking about. Endless puberty. But ask your question.
Yeah. So my question, that putting these two pieces in dialogue with one another, I was interested in the role that temporality plays in your practice. So fucking up with the sun is static in the sense that, I can stand in front of it. It's the same piece. It's not unfolding over time. Whereas Untitled and Will Be Again is unfolding. It's changing. If I stand there over the full course of the hour, my relationship with the piece will have changed. So I'd be interested to hear what role time and temporality play in your practice, and if you think that a static piece and a piece that unfolds through time can convey different aesthetic messages, different political messages.
I think every piece has its best output, right? So it was idea driven. Like I said, this one, it was about that endless becoming, endless potential. To me, that implied a linear format, like film. Fucking up with the sun is remnants. It is something that is over, and it is something that is done. So specific to those two, that's why that implied to me that it had to be like a stationary kind of...
Although interestingly, when you describe it that way, temporality is an important part of this piece as well, right? Because the very idea that we are walking in on something that has already happened, and we're sort of belated in relation to the piece itself.
No, that's actually a really good point. To me, sculpture is always inherently performative. There's always about, I always think of sculpture as something, even if it's very formal, on a plinth, it always seems like evidence. I've always thought that. So I guess actually, this is why these talks are good. I really never thought about it this way either. I think they're always I'm kind of making this up as we go along, but maybe it's always temporal.
Yeah.
But it's just whether it's in a state of process or evidence of something that had happened. With Republic Mashup, those faces are it's like performative object, something had happened that I kind of froze. There's a relationship in my mind between casting an object and photography. And so it freezes a kind of singular moment in time forever. But still there's that element of that's the moment that is frozen. Yeah. So That's a really good point that I never really thought of. Like maybe it is all about a moment, whether it's just in progress or frozen.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like in terms of where it situates the viewer, that in a piece like this or in Fucking Up with the Sun, the viewer is sort of always coming on the scene afterwards, after something else has happened, whereas in Untitled, we're part of it or participating in a certain way, so we don't have that same sense of belatedness vis-a-vis the work itself or the moment, because it's not capturing a moment, it is a moment.
That's cool, actually. That's really, that's actually, that's, I never thought about it. You're totally right. You're totally right. This is just another, there's not a lot to say, I mean, unless you have a question, but this is another working drawing, much like the one with all the microphones. This is a still from the Reagan assassination. And I don't know if you guys can see, but I do a lot of, like I said, I studied textiles in undergrad, and I use textiles a lot now, but oftentimes now it never gets out of the studio. It's just like stuff I do to figure ideas out. It's a way of drawing for me, because I'm much better at textiles than I am as a draftsman, I would say. And I don't know if you can see, but there's stitching going down his lapel.
So can I take this as an occasion to ask you a general question about your practice?
Sure.
So you say that you're making art that's about politics, but it's not in and of itself political. And that's an interesting claim to make, because it seems to betray a certain ambivalence about political engagement. And so I'm wondering what the source or nature of this ambivalence is, and what you see as the pitfalls of engaged or committed art that's political in the traditional sense, and how do you try to avoid these pitfalls in your work?
Let me take that question apart.
Okay.
I am definitely not ambivalent about politics. I'm like a total political junkie. My parents, I come from a political family. My parents have been, so it's something I grew up around. What is very political about my work is the kind of proactive stance of engagement with it. Like when you were talking about the manifestations of power, and this sounds Pollyannish, but I honestly think that like to make effective political change, whatever that is, one must understand how politics and power is exercised in society. And that is where it is very political. Like, so it's more of a pedagogical function of awareness. That I feel really strongly about. Now, your second part of your question is about political art. I don't like the term political art, but maybe what I'll use is activist, work with an activist stance. I don't make that because I think it's hard to make good activist art. And I think we live in a time now where the arguments are so much more complex that to have like a really kind of strong, monotheistic, that word chosen intentionally, monotheistic stance about a particular viewpoint, a particular action that is appropriate for a situation. I don't know about that. Like, I think it's difficult to make complex art with a really singular message to it. So that's why I don't do it. Now, its efficacy, if I understand your question correctly, I think it is possible. I think there are artists today who do it. Sam Durant is an artist who I have a lot of respect for, who I do think his work can be really strident, really kind of one-liner, but really good art nonetheless. My interest is maybe more abstract about how the politics is exercised, about how it operates, rather than the kind of nitty-gritty of a particular political motivation.
But would you see that abstract attempt to figure out how politics works or how power manifests visually as a precondition for activism that might take place in another forum or another medium?
Yeah. I don't know if that has to happen in art. But yeah, I mean, I do think that if you are going to make change, however defined, I do think you have to understand how change is made and understand the mechanics of politics and the mechanics of the communication of power, because at some point you'd be engaging in those.
Yeah. But it's interesting because it seems like that is a fairly complex task, so I'm wondering why you're confident that art can perform that task and less confident that it can perform the task of advocacy or activism.
Super good question, one that I'm very glad you asked me. Because I think art can deal with that kind of stuff really well. Like art's good at dealing with abstract ideas like power, and how power is exercised in form. I think art is less good at dealing with less abstract ideas of like, the war in Iraq is bad or whatever. Art doesn't do that very well because it can't talk about the thinly sliced aspects of a complex political subject like that, but it can talk about the thinly sliced ways that power is formed in a larger society. I do think it's better at issues like that because those issues deal with how things are presented to people and how issues are presented to people subconsciously as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. So let's move on to this piece, which you talk about the title, and then we can talk about titles.
Sure. This is a piece that I literally just finished 2 weeks ago, and you are the first group of people to see it. It's going to be, this is going to be at a show in April in Germany, actually. It's called The Morally Ambiguous Precedent of Abstraction. And when I moved to Chicago last year, I didn't have a lot of friends, and I didn't know what to do with myself. And I had just finished the Washington Colorfield School, and I was still I didn't know if I had like blown my wad of interest in like bureaucracies and like how laws were passed and yada, yada, yada. So I spent a lot of time at the Daly Center, which is an awesome place. And I would go to press conferences and like stuff like that, like it was just really, I was totally jazzed on it. Like how, and like it's very theatrical and like, it makes sense for the Washington Colorfield Schools, like watching that stuff in real life. And so I took all these pictures and some film and whatever. But I couldn't figure out what to make of it. But I was really interested in behind, oftentimes at press conferences, there's these curtains behind the people talking to the press. And so at the same time I was looking at that, and I was also looking at a lot of good Frank Stella, like Frank Stella black paintings. And I was interested in abstraction, these kind of opaque, impenetrable objects, and then like the meaning impregnated in them, and how that worked or didn't work or whatever. And I was interested in it sculpturally too, these really kind of monolithic forms, really difficult to access. And so I started looking at these curtains, just the curtains in isolation, as these sort of monochromes. And so that's kind of, that was the genesis of the work. And at first it was just the curtain, like a photograph. This photograph, I'm sorry, this is important. This photograph is about 6 feet tall. So it's really big. It's an imposing object. It's about 6 feet by 4.5 feet. So it's a weird proportion. I actually spent a lot of time just cutting out pieces of paper. Like in my studio now is a big piece of paper that I spent months trying to figure out just the right proportion of this thing. Anyway, so it was just a curtain, 6 foot tall curtain, but then I started working back into it kind of sculpturally, cutting it, tweaking ends of it, until I arrived at the form you see here. So that's a really long answer of what you're looking at. But.
So I love the title, and I find it's really provocative in its own ambiguity. So right. Could you say a little bit about the function that titles serve in your practice? Because we've already heard several great titles.
Yeah.
This one might be the most provocative.
I'm super into titles. I think they're really, I feel like I tell a lot of my graduate students who are in the class, I feel like I tell you guys this a lot, like titles are a really giving gesture on the part of the artist to the viewer. Like, it's nice. It's a nice thing to do, right? Like it, especially when you're dealing with a work that can be opaque or whatever, difficult to access. Contemporary art's scary to a lot of people. I think it's easy to drink the Kool-Aid when you make it, that it is difficult. And it should be difficult. Like, art should be hard. But that doesn't mean that you have to be a jerk about it. So in my mind, I mean, I'll get to the specifics of this title. I was going to say,
because this title's pretty difficult.
Yeah, I'll get to that. Just give me some time. But it defines the playing field. I think you'll give me that. Though. Yeah. It tells the viewer in what avenue to intellectually interrogate the piece. And in that sense, I do think it's a giving gesture. Now, with this, just to recap for if you weren't paying, it's the morally ambiguous precedent of abstraction, which sounds really cool. Like I mean, there is an element of poetry to titling. Like I want them to be sexy words put together that makes you want to investigate the thing deeper. I do think abstraction is morally ambiguous. Like I have moral qualms with it. I think when you abstract something, it's easy to treat it with disrespect. 40 people get blown up by something, like, I don't, that just I just glaze. That's a cliched answer, yeah. But it's kind of true. You just kind of glaze over. And like I was thinking about that, and what's the relationship between abstraction of life, abstraction of money, like all the money that we've lost, like these numbers that we're talking about, they're abstract. Like no one has any idea. You lose your mortgage, you get kicked out of your house. That's not abstract. What is the relationship between cultural abstraction or moral abstraction, if that's a real term, and abstraction and art? Yeah. Like that's an interesting. I think there's more gas in that tank. Like I think, like I said, I like literally just had this photograph printed. I'm interested now with that. Like what is the relationship between abstraction and value is something that I think I can run with that. So that's this piece.
Yeah, and it comes back actually in interesting ways to the earlier discussion about the pitfalls of activist art, right? And what art can and cannot do well. But here it seems like you have you're portraying some sort of ethical qualm about one of the things art does do well, which is abstraction. Right.
Well, yeah. I'm a self-loathing Jew, right? So I have to worry about something.
So let's look again at Republic Prussia,
right.
Which we've seen a few times. So one of the things I love about this piece.
Actually, let me say I want something. Yeah. So I told you guys about yeah, right.
Okay.
So I just want to give the overview again. Like we already talked about the pieces and the table, but the battery thing. So underneath this table is this kind of MacGyvered audio system run by this battery. And it's set like every 5 minutes, every hour and a half, every 20 minutes, at these completely random time intervals. It plays an audio clip from The Deer Hunter, a movie with Robert De Niro, where Robert De Niro takes this dude and he throws him against the wall, or against the car, actually. And he says, this isn't anything but this. This isn't anything, this is just this, only this. You got me, motherfucker? It's only this. And like this is really kind of base material argument. Like it's just sculpture, it's just stuff, which I was really interested in. Okay, but now continue.
Okay, so one of the things, I don't know if you can see it in this picture. Okay, you can see it better in this picture, is that in this piece and in some other pieces, one of which we have yet to see, but we'll see in a minute, I love the way you're using gold and gilt. And so I'm wondering, whence this obsession with gold, with gilt? Is it an art historical reference? Does it bear political connotations, or both? Why all the bling?
Why all the bling? Because, everyone loves bling. Different. It's hard to answer that question, but different, like in Goldchain's Headspace Freedom, this piece, which we'll look at in a minute, it was art historical. I'm gonna just use that for foreshadowing.
Yeah.
With this, I wanted to like elevate these value systems, like as, like they're on these plinths. This is really stupid. Like art can be really dumb. I feel like it's okay. This is dumb. So I had this idea that like this revolutionary table was like the tabula rasa from which these American value systems emanate, which is totally hokey. And I feel silly saying it, but that is kind of what I was thinking. So we have always been a very materialist society. We've always been interested in wealth. We're like a very kind of commercial society. So using these wealthy materials and I would like to add for a point that these are totally bling in that it's kind of ghetto rich. Like this is gold leaf over steel. Like it's really low quality gold, really low quality steel. Like it's not nice, it's just the illusion of wealth or the illusion of bling, which, I think it's kind of insider baseball conversation, but I do think it's important. I do think it's an important point. So it made sense to me on just a kind of formal sculptural level with the richness of the table to have it. I wanted it to be kind of an opulent work. Like this is the most like a rich meal kind of thing I've ever made. And I thought it made sense for the subject matter.
And is there an implied contrast between what I'm assuming, perhaps falsely, is the abstemiousness of the lifestyle of these radical people in their communes, and then the sort of luxuriousness of the materials?
No, I didn't think about that. I mean, to me, they are about American values rather than the specificity of these guys in their compounds, which were really Spartan. You're right. But yeah, no, I didn't think about that at all.
Okay.
This is a piece that I feel like has been on every. I'm sick of this piece. It's been around. This is a piece called Gold Chains Headspace Freedom, and it is. I filed a freedom of information brief from the federal government, and got. Well, there's two bits of information that were put together. One, these were based on the suicide watch cages, not at Guantanamo, because they wouldn't tell me specifically what was at Guantanamo. But these were the suicide watch cages that the federal government uses in federal government holding facilities for non-criminal captives. That's not the word they use, but detainees, thank you. So i.e. Guantanamo or the Brig in North Carolina. It's basically a 2.5 foot square cage, so you can't sit down, you can't turn around, you can't do anything. It's over 9 feet tall, it's bolted onto the ground so you can't climb out of it. You're just in a cage. This is gold plated. As you walk around it, you can't really see from a still image. There's a really cool like moire pattern that happens because of the weaving. Like it kind of flickers. Within the cage, within one of the second cages, is a guitar amplifier that you see here. Out of the guitar amplifier at the same time, so on top of one another, there is a Beach Boys song called "In My Room" playing. And a song by Public Enemy, Black Steel on the Hour of Chaos, which is on a nation, takes a nation of millions to hold us back. They're both songs about containment or imprisonment. One, self-imposed imprisonment in my room. One by the state, Black Steel. Both of them are about enlightenment through imprisonment. Julie.
Okay, so another question about activist art or non-activist art. So at first glance, I, and presumably many other people, might interpret this piece as a critique of American foreign policy and then would read the gold as further criticizing the complicity of American foreign policy with a particular brand of American capitalism. Meaning we'd be tempted to interpret it as an activist piece whose activist aim was to criticize American foreign policy and the complicity of American foreign policy with capitalism. Is that wrong? Is it misguided? Is it overly simplistic? What would I be missing if that's how I read this piece?
It was not my intent. I was interested in the issues. I was honestly interested in issues of enlightenment. Like I'm really interested in that cliche of like the man who goes on the mountain for 20 years and comes down with this wisdom, or and the relationship between that of the man who gets sent to prison and comes out a wise man. You know, that was my interest. And I will say, you know, and I used to deny it to day's end. I think I'm slightly more mature as an artist now. I am really pissed off about Guantanamo. Like it really made me mad in a way that no political thing ever had before. And I think it would be bad self-analysis to say that that was not in this piece when I was producing it. That is not something, honestly, I ever admitted before. But as an artist, it wasn't my interest, and it wasn't what I was thinking about. But, you know, stuff comes out in your art, right? Like that's what art, it's cheaper in therapy. Or actually, this piece was not cheaper in therapy. But, you know, it is an undercurrent in the work, of course, but I don't hold it up as a particularly like strident piece on a particular thing. But you know, you're not wrong. One is not wrong for seeing that in it. Through that analysis, I don't think it's a good piece. Like, I think it's really easy to say Guantanamo's bad. You know, like that's not that interesting. When you start talking about how does one become enlightened through containment, and the gold is an art historical reference to kind of religious art, in this case, to go back to one of your earlier questions. I think that's a much more interesting conversation to have surrounding the piece than anything about Guantanamo.
But and why, I mean, what's the significance of the Freedom of Information Act? Why do you need to know the real specificity of
you don't. I mean, I told you guys because we're here in this kind of situation it is, but, you know, that's not even in the kind of press materials about this piece. That's not even really released.
Okay, well, I guess I have one more question that I can pose before we open it up for the audience questions, and this could be perhaps a prelude or segue, which is I'd be interested if you could say something about the format you've chosen for this talk tonight. Why, instead of giving a traditional artist talk, did you decide to stage this conversation between the two of us and in a minute between all of us? The past couple of months I've been giving a lot of artist talks, and I'm sick of them. And so that's the main reason. Like, I'm a little bored of doing it, and I'm just bored of it. Also, I work here, so it does seem kind of weird to like give an artist talk at the place I work. And I just thought this would be interesting. And because I work here, there is a very kind of traditional view here at the University of Chicago that there's all this, and then there's arts. And that it's a really kind of, it's a wrong mentality. And it's an old mentality. And I think after this conversation, it's quite clear that there's issues at play in my work that make sense for you, a political scientist, to be talking to me about. Yeah. And I like you, me and you are friends. Like, I am interested in your kind of reading of art and of politics. And so I thought this would be cool. Well, I hope you also thought it was cool and have questions to ask.
Any questions?
Yeah, I have a couple. The first maybe to you, Julie. So it makes a lot of sense probably to all of us that you're here, that you would kind of interrogate the artist and tease out in this way something that might seem especially interesting in contemporary political culture. But I'm really curious about, like, what would it look like for Geof to enter your world, right? And, or to say, what place might contemporary art practice have in the traditional sphere of presenting political information? Next to C-SPAN, what role could we play? I don't know, as ourselves, in the same way that you didn't have to change very much about your language or demeanor to talk.
Or did you?
Or did you?
No, probably not that much. Yeah.
So yeah, your thoughts on kind of, you know, if we would flip this, how would it look, or what would it feel like, or
And tell the truth.
I mean, I guess I have two thoughts. One is that, I mean, I think some of the questions that I've been asking about, you know, abstraction and the relation of abstraction to activism could be asked of me and in my own work, and are things that we as political theorists ask all the time, because we are dealing in ideas that are somewhat abstract, but usually there is implicitly an idea that we're motivated by normative concerns and are trying to speak to contemporary politics, even if we're doing so in a roundabout way. So I think those kind of political and ethical questions about how we can speak, or whether we should be speaking to contemporary politics, even while we're doing something that could seem abstract or removed, are questions that could be addressed to me and that we do try to address. So I guess that was my first thought. My second thought is that, I mean, there is a sense in which I guess a lot of what political scientists see themselves doing, I guess, would be, you know, explaining how power works. In the mainstream of political science, a lot of that is done through quantitative analysis. So it's all about numbers and, you know, running numbers through computers and taking things to a level of abstraction that I think sometimes does seem kind of dehumanizing and at cross purposes with the expressed goals of the project. So, I mean, it could be the case that bringing a visual representation of how power works into conversation could be a really interesting counterpoint to the normal way that political scientists try to capture how power works, which is through quantitative analysis that takes things to a level of abstraction that actually can be depoliticizing. So I guess I would wonder or be interested in seeing if you could bring a visual analysis to the table, would it actually not be depoliticizing in the same way, and so could reinvigorate that conversation.
I was interested in your the Alan Greenspan part of the Mason-Dixon sculpture, and I guess I wanted to, you talked a lot about the projection of the other part of the sculpture.
Sure.
In terms of the content, and not so much with this one. And I have a particularly uncanny relationship with this, because I actually a few years ago went to a protest where Alan Greenspan was speaking, and I think we gave out that picture on a sheet.
Oh, yeah.
So it really resonated with me on a lot of different levels. Because I think I know the picture. It's a very famous.
It's very famous, yeah.
So I guess I wanted to hear how and why you chose Greenspan, and what specificity went into that choice in terms of his philosophy of, you know, economics or money, and the role that those ideas have had in the country in the past 25 or 30 years. And then also I wanted to point out to you how interesting I find it that that gold seems to be such a privileged material in some of your work here. And then we have Greenspan, the monetarist, who is being described in his language as sort of lightness and liquidity is actually what you use, which I thought was such a fascinating word in the context of this particular man and the current fiscal crisis. So those were my associations to it, and they're very interesting and contradictory, and I just wanted to hear more about yours.
Sure. I mean, I was interested in him as the oracle of abstract capital. The idea of him as a representation of abstraction was really interesting to me, and the fact that it is made of light, and that, you know, to me there's a metaphorical relationship between light and abstraction, and he did represent, the monetary things were not I'm stumbling over the words, but him as a representation of a system that privileged abstraction was something that was really interesting to me. And this was, obviously before the crisis that we're in now, where he was still the oracle. And that that was the primary thinking behind it. Putting that in opposition to kind of the base materiality of the Dixon was the relationship. Now, the gold thing that you talk about is interesting because, I mean, this is a really dorky conversation, but we're not on the gold standard, and blah, 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 blah. That I can't claim the intelligence that was intentional, that part. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
You're in the back or first.
I was wondering if you could explain the crate that's under the Dixon.
Oh yeah, it's just a cat. I'm sorry, I should have done that before. It's a cast zinc. So it's just a milk crate with some books on it that I then cast in zinc. And it was in my studio for like 6 months on a milk crate and some books. And I was trying to figure out the right plinth for it. And then, I realized it was there all along, and so I just made it. I made the thing the thing.
And you mentioned before that you wanted a certain subjectivity within the Dixon that's similar to the object itself. And is that the reason you didn't want it on the floor? Like without a pedestal, you wouldn't have it remain?
Yeah. That's true. Yeah.
Earlier when you were talking about activist art, you were saying that it's difficult to make complex art with a singular message. And I know you said that you personally don't feel ambivalence about politics or politics, but what do you think about ambivalence in activist art? I mean, it seems like you are saying it has to have a singular message.
I want to start out. I'm talking about just for me rather than statement. No, I think it can, of course, have, like the artist I referred to, Sam Durant, as someone who I think is really good at that. Certainly there's ambivalence in his work, but it's unabashedly directly political. I'm not sure actually what your question is, but the answer is yes. I do think there can be political art that has ambivalence within it. It's just not what I do, I suppose. Right? Is that, yeah? Did I answer your question? I'm not quite sure what you're asking.
No, it's just interesting that it seems like you were saying that it had to have a singular message.
I didn't, no. I'm sorry if that's what came across.
No, I am always concerned with like money, money.
We all are.
Yeah, money and art production.
Yeah.
And I wonder maybe what is the relationship, just to follow up to your question, of like where we pitch ourselves as practitioners and the position we say, like, is there a pitfall to saying, I'm an artist with a deeply political bend? If you situate yourself too much, do you run the risk of marginalizing your practice to a commercial audience? Or are you thinking about this mix of how my practice registers in its contemporarity in relationship to the market, how I talk about myself, how I show myself?
Yeah, I think all artists do that, right? Because just speaking for myself, like I want my work to operate in a larger system, like engaging with like thinkers, collectors, museums. Like, the work has, I'm ambitious for the work, right? So I guess, this is also something I'm just learning out how to do, but like I want the work to operate in a lot of different systems effectively. And to do that, it has to, I guess I'm not quite sure what you're asking me. So if you're asking me whether the work is gallery and museum based, and does it become neutered in its political message in those contexts?
No, I'm not even that, I don't have that much of a bias. It's more, I'm asking, how are you thinking about these relationships between a political position, commodity, institutionality,
I see.
ambition. I don't know what your mix. I imagine there could be any number of mixes, and I'm just curious.
Yeah. I mean, the work is object-oriented, and I do think that there's a relationship between making objects that deal with the form's power. Like, I haven't quite even figured it out for me, but an interest for me just in making work is a relationship between objects as representations of power. Like, how do you turn these kind of dissipated ideas into concise physical objects and have them circulate as that is something that, for me, has some currency in some way. I don't feel any rub personally in having objects that comment about power operate in arenas that are completely dependent on systems of power, like museums or whatever. Like, that's fine. There was a point that I lost the point that I wanted to make with that. But I mean, we're now, I think our art is made in a post-boom environment now, and I think it's going to be really different in a way that I'm really looking forward to. Like the gallery that I work with, I won't be able to afford to make some of the stuff that you saw here today. And that, to me, is exciting. Yeah. Yeah.
I had a question about the Washington Colorfield School, and was wondering if you might say something about the relationship between the banality of the C-SPAN and the ideology of like Greenberg, if that was like a binary you were trying to drop in person to, or?
No, it wasn't. I mean, my interest in the as the video cycles through, there's like these, like I said, it washes from R to G to B, and those kind of fields of color is what I was interested in. So, I mean, obviously, the Washington Colorfield School is kind of really specifically located in the city where both this art movement came from and Congress. And so I was interested in that connection, but there's no like Greenbergian analysis content, really. Yeah?
Could you say a little bit more about the curtain piece?
Yeah. I mean, no, really, but because I like literally just finished it, so I would be really curious about you telling me something that you're thinking about it.
Well, I think I got, I think I was in perhaps an overly abstract aesthetic reverie while you were speaking about the process of how you came to make it. So maybe I've forgotten what you were saying a little bit, but this seems to me to be sort of kind of a really quintessentially self-referential piece, in that like sort of the paradigmatic story of Trump Lloyd, right, is that you want to pull away the curtain, but the curtain is the artwork, right? Right. Or you know, thinking about like the ideas of Baroque art and the fold, right? Like the and also thinking about it staging something.
The staging, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, please, fine.
The staging thing was something that I was thinking about, like having the background become foreground on a formal level. The background becomes surface.
Yeah.
Was something that I was really interested in, kind of like on an art dork level. Like I didn't know whether anyone else would be interested in that, but I like it.
No, I think that the idea of the first, like the figural dimension of the ground, right? It's sort of like you put a plinth on a plinth or something like that.
Right.
It's really, I mean, that's a really amazing idea. But one thing that I also really love about this piece is the fact that you folded it. Like, so you folded it kind of against the grain of the other fold?
I flipped it.
Or, wait, explain.
So you have a curtain. This is going to be hard to explain.
Okay.
And then I made that cut, you see, right? And then in Photoshop, I mirrored it. Right, I used the mirror, you know.
Right. But I think one thing that does is it brings the fact that it's a photograph of a textile, it brings it back. It's sort of like almost like a Mobius strip, like turns the photograph itself into a kind of textile medium by making that part of the surface of the photograph itself. It's like, yeah. Anyway, I just think it's really amazing, and it's like a real nexus of like self-referential critique of abstraction. So,
thanks.
anyway.
Could I just throw something on? This one was especially interesting to me precisely because of the history of kind of the convergence of aesthetics and politics up until the 16th, 17th, 18th century, which were fundamentally about theatrical practices. And how that is really the late 18th century and the kind of emergence of liberal democracy, the kind of anti-aesthetic political conjunction, which now keeps coming back as the specter of kind of fascism. Ultimately, how there's been a kind of tendency now to kind of get rid of a thematic investigation of aesthetics and politics, and how this brings that back in a certain sense, but both by bringing to the foreground this theatrical nature, which at the same time sort of is bringing to the foreground how much has been covered over in recent history.
Right.
I mean, in philosophical aesthetic works, aesthetics and history, aesthetics and politics really has been demonized.
Right.
And to really think that.
Well, it's been associated with fascism.
Exactly. I mean,
Like,
in especially the French tradition,
right.
Those guys are really interested in precisely how it becomes a kind of prototypical sort of fascist sort of model in all serious one respects, and really try to reimagine that in that connection, epistemological or something outside of just sheerly good. But this is really fascinating for that.
Right. But I like the, I mean, yes, yeah, but I like the curtain, that's interesting that you said that, because I mean I was aware of that or thinking about that on kind of like an intuitive formal level, but it's nice to hear, because I mean, like I said, no one's seen this piece besides me, so I'm curious to hear your guys' feedback of it. Yeah.
My ears perked up when you mentioned the Lilly engineering. I kept sort of, as my mind was wandering for years, but I was kind of like trying to place that phrase in the context of a lot of the things that you've made that you show pictures of, and trying to see evidence of it, or maybe I missed your point that it wasn't so much about, like you had this one piece where you said, the Dixon belief that it had to sort of be barely competent at being itself, that was the measure of its worth or whatever. But when you mentioned that it was a zinc casting, I thought, well, that's really industrial and kind of like overshooting its need.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, two things like that. The hillbilly engineering, I could never claim that aesthetic as my own. Like, I mean, my stuff's totally slick because that's the aesthetic that I work in. Like, and I'm, that's what it needs to be what I want it to be. This thing is different in that, like the zinc crate. Yeah, I mean, that's not hillbilly engineering. That's turning like kind of laying around the studio object into like a singular object. What I was referring to, or what my friend was telling me to do, and he was right, was just the way the upholstering was done. Like it's barely holding itself together. Like the threads are loose, it's falling apart over this, really kind of overly concise geometric form.
Yeah, I guess this was also up for quite a while when we were talking, so I was looking at the shape, and maybe it's just an optical illusion of the slide, but it seems like it's not quite right either. And geometrically, for what it is, the unnamed shape, it must just be what happens when it's wrapped, but the lines don't seem like perfectly parallel.
It's not like it's tall. It's not a circle, or it's not a like it's taller than it is wide. so it is off. I mean, it's not the image. It's the way it is, and it's like on this weird kind of angle point. So yeah, you are right. And then that was intentional. Like I wanted it kind of there, but kind of unstable on its plinth. Any other? Oh. No, go ahead. I mean, sometimes like I alternate back and forth, but yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, the answer is because that's because of how I wanted it. You know, like artists can do that. But also, like, if you really run down it, it's like, again, it's like a gross generalization, but the Dixon was the North, like it was where all the capital was. The Mason was the agrarian, you know, it's where like redneck engineering was. Like, it's a kind of gross stereotype that I was interested in, the gross stereotype of the Mason-Dixon line and making the piece.
Maybe just one of the things that's interesting to me is that your work violates one of these really basic things that I'm trying to explain something's modernist or postmodernist. The simple answer is if you can see the edges of it, it's modernist.
Mm-hmm.
There you go. So those problems are solved. And I think it's really fascinating to me that you really violated that very well. And I think I see that as some sort of, I mean, for me, this is engaged with capital and modernism.
Absolutely.
But how exactly do you see it engaged?
I don't know. I mean, I'm interested in their legacy as much as I am in the work itself of capital M modernism. Like the kind of failed utopianism of it is really kind of intellectually fascinating to me. How it is like in the aesthetics or whatever, like I see it, but I don't have control. Like it's something I'm trying to figure out in my own practice, actually. Like, yeah, that's a really bad answer. Like, but
like the ambitious quality of modernism is a kind of political backdrop.
Sure.
That flows through.
Sure. And like the social project, you know, like the ability to kind of tackle these issues or whatever these issues are, is, I mean, I'm an aggressive guy, so I like appreciate that ambition. Like I think it's kind of ballsy that, you know, someone would think they can solve it, but the failure of it, the heroic failure of it is just as interesting to me. Good? All right, thank you. Thank you very much.